At August 30th, 1943, 1:20 in the afternoon, over Kahili Airfield, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. At 20,000 feet, the air temperature was -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was a pale, hard blue. First Lieutenant Kenneth Ambrose Walsh was alone. His engine had failed on the outbound leg. He had already landed once, swapped into a borrowed Corsair, not even his own aircraft, and flown 150 miles back north to find his formation. He never found them. What he found instead was something that should have ended his war in under 60 seconds. Approximately 50 Japanese Zero fighters. Walsh was 26 years old. He had logged more than 2,000 hours of flight time, and he was the first pilot in the entire United States military to become an ace flying the Vought F4U Corsair, the machine the Japanese called Whistling Death because of the sound its air intakes made at full power. By the morning of August 30th, Walsh had already destroyed 16 Japanese aircraft. He had been shot down twice in 18 days. He had crash-landed a flaming Corsair into a muddy airstrip and walked away. 2 weeks earlier, he had pulled out of an inverted dive at the crater rim of an active volcano and barely avoided blacking out. He kept flying, now alone in a borrowed aircraft with 2,400 rounds of ammunition across 6.50 caliber machine guns. He had 30 seconds of firing time to spend against 50 enemy fighters. The mathematics of what happened next were brutal, and Walsh later said only this about the moment. There were times I tangled with a Zero at slow speed, one-on-one. I considered myself fortunate to survive a battle. On August 30th, he did not have 1 Zero. He had 50. He attacked anyway. Before he was finished, 4 of those Zeros were in the water, and the doctrine he had built, dismissed by desk officers, ignored in early briefings, and proven 1 kill at a time in the furnace over the Solomons, would change how every Corsair pilot in the Pacific fought for the rest of the war. In the chest pocket of his flight suit that morning was a single photograph, his wife, his son barely a year old. He had carried it on every mission. He would carry it on 140 combat missions before the war ended. This is the story of how a mechanic from Brooklyn wrote the book on how to kill a Zero. Kenneth Ambrose Walsh was not supposed to be a pilot. He was born on November 24th, 1916 in Brooklyn, New York, to Irish immigrant parents. His father was an electrician. His grandfather had come from nothing. Walsh grew up watching a city that rewarded the people who showed up early and stayed late, not the people who theorized from a distance. At 17, 3 weeks after his birthday, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station and signed the papers. He had left high school at 16. They made him a mechanic. He spent 2 years on the flight line at Quantico, Virginia, wiping oil from engine cowlings, listening to the particular note each aircraft's engine made at full throttle, learning to read mechanical failure from vibration before the gauges said anything. He had not yet flown a single hour, but he understood machines the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not from books alone, but from the inside. In March 1936, he entered flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola. He was a private. He had no civilian flying background. He earned his wings in April 1937. He was 20 years old. He was still a private. The Corps promoted him to corporal. For several years, Walsh flew observation and scouting aircraft, watching the fighter pilots from a distance. One afternoon above Quantico, he watched 2 lieutenants, one of them a compact combative pilot named Gregory Boyington, perform an unauthorized mock dogfight that lasted an hour and drew every Marine on the base out to watch. When Boyington ran dry of fuel, he landed his fighter on the rifle range. Walsh stood on the flight line and watched Boyington walk away laughing. Walsh wanted that, not the recklessness, the absolute mastery of an aircraft in 3 dimensions. By June 1941, with more than 2,000 flight hours logged and a sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, Walsh transferred to a fighter squadron. He was flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Within weeks, the Pacific was on fire, and every lesson the U.S. military had ever written about air combat was being tested against an enemy that had spent a decade perfecting theirs. Walsh watched what happened to the men who had not done their homework. He decided he would do his. In October 1942, Walsh was commissioned second lieutenant and assigned to a new squadron, VMF 124, forming at Camp Kearney near San Diego. VMF 124 would be the first Marine unit in the Pacific equipped with the Vought F4U Corsair. The plane was enormous. It had the biggest engine, the largest propeller, and the highest speed of any naval fighter ever built. It was also in the candid assessment of veteran pilots, trying to kill them before the Japanese got the chance. The torque from the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine tried to flip the aircraft on every takeoff. The cockpit sat so far back in the fuselage that on approach the pilot could not see the runway. The landing gear was unforgiving. The U.S. Navy had already banned the Corsair from carrier operations. It handed the problem to the Marines. Walsh, who had spent years listening to engine tolerances and reading structural behavior, saw something different in the Corsair. He saw a machine that was not too dangerous to fly, and it was a machine that required more skill than most pilots had been taught to apply. He intended to apply it. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join, 10 seconds to sign up, link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you. On February 14, 1943, 12 days after VMF 124's Corsairs touched down at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the squadron flew its second combat mission. 8 American aircraft went down. The Japanese lost 3. The engagement was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The official doctrine for fighter escort was straightforward. Protect the bombers. Stay with the formation. Do not pursue. You do not dive. Engage only aircraft that directly threaten your assigned B-24s. The theory was sound. An escort that abandoned its bombers to chase Zeros was no escort at all. Staff officers had drawn the logic on chalkboards in briefing rooms from Pearl Harbor to Washington. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been in production since 1940. Its pilots had been flying it in combat over China since 1937. They had refined every weakness out of their engagement geometry. They knew with mathematical precision what American fighter pilots were trained to do, and they had mapped that doctrine's blind spots like surveyors. The Zero weighed 5,300 pounds. At low altitude and low speed, its rate of turn was unmatched by any aircraft in the Pacific. In a slow-turning fight below 300 miles per hour, a Zero could point its nose at any American fighter within a single full circle. It could outclimb any adversary below 18,000 feet in a slow-speed climb, and it could absorb a modest amount of incoming fire. But it did not need to absorb much. It relied on never being hit. Japanese doctrine prescribed a specific geometry. Wait for American fighters to descend to escort altitude. Let them commit to the bomber stream, then attack from above and from the sides in coordinated waves, forcing the Americans into slow-speed turning engagements where Zero pilots had decisive advantage. If the Americans tried to run, the Zero climbed after them. If they tried to dive, the Zero descended with them, the advantage evaporating only below 10,000 feet, where the engine supercharger efficiency began to favor American aircraft. The American answer, written into doctrine, was formation defense. Stay together, use overlapping fields of fire, engage in straight passes, and then return to formation altitude. The Zero pilots had studied this response. In coordinated attacks, the lead elements drew the defensive fire. The trailing elements punched through the gaps. The geometry of a tight escort formation, when attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, became a predictable series of blind spots. 5 o'clock low, 7 o'clock high, where successive passes arrived before any American aircraft could reposition. In the first week at Guadalcanal, Walsh flew with the formation. He watched what happened. He watched a Corsair pilot at 8 o'clock below him get hit by a Zero that had arrived from exactly the angle that the formation's defensive geometry could not cover. He watched the man spin into the jungle below Choiseul. He watched the formation hold as it was supposed to. He watched a second Zero take advantage of the defensive commitment to the formation and hit another aircraft from 6 o'clock low, the altitude at which the Corsair's long nose created a partial visual blind spot. Walsh counted the angles. He ran the mathematics. At low altitude, fighting at slow speed to hold formation position, the Corsair's advantages, its speed, its climb rate above 20,000 feet, its ability to absorb gunfire and keep flying, were all unused. The doctrine was turning the F4U's strengths into irrelevances. It was asking men to fight the Zero's war on the Zero's terms. Walsh's counter-theory was not complicated. It was almost simple. That was what made the resistance to it so frustrating. The altitude was the only variable that mattered. At 25,000 feet, the Corsair's supercharged engine produced power that the Zero's unsupercharged power plant could not match. Above 300 miles per hour in a dive, the Zero's control surfaces became stiff to the point of near immobility, a physical characteristic discovered from intelligence reports on captured aircraft and confirmed in the first weeks of actual combat. A Zero pilot diving at high speed could not roll effectively, could not pull a hard turn, could not follow a target through a high-speed brake. Walsh's formula was not a technique. It was a physics problem with one solution: arrive high, dive fast, fire in a single passing attack, climb back to altitude before the Zero could recover, do not turn, do not slow down. And never let the fight become a turning engagement below 300 miles per hour. The concept had a name that predated Walsh: boom and zoom. But in the early weeks of 1943 over the Solomons, nobody was applying it systematically. The escort doctrine required pilots to stay with the bombers. That meant staying at bomber altitude, typically 18,000 to 20,000 feet. It meant flying at bomber speed. It meant being reactive rather than aggressive. Every time a Zero formation rolled in from above, the Corsair pilots were responding from a position of disadvantage that Walsh believed was entirely self-imposed. He began working it out in small steps. On April 1st, 1943, patrolling over the Russell Islands, Walsh's flight watched a set of P-38 Lightnings get jumped by Zeros. The Zeros had not noticed the Corsairs. Walsh turned his flight back from their homeward course and climbed above the fight. Then he pushed over into a high-speed diving pass. He missed his first deflection shot. His wingman hit. They climbed. Walsh came around again, still above, still fast. He lined up a second Zero, fired a short burst, and watched it come apart. 2 kills, no losses. The whole engagement had lasted 90 seconds. When Walsh described the fight afterward, he was specific about what had worked. He had not been braver than the Zero pilots. He had not outmaneuvered them. He had simply held a position from which the Zero's strengths were nullified before the engagement began. The institutional response was polite and non-committal. There was no written doctrine change. There was no formal endorsement. What there was, quietly, it was the awareness that Walsh had figured out something real. And the expectation, also quiet, that he would continue proving it. His score climbed. 3 zeros on May 13th, 2 more in June. The altitude first approach worked every time he applied it and failed, or nearly cost him his life. Every time circumstances or the emergency of a mission forced him to abandon it. By mid-August 1943, Walsh had 10 confirmed kills. VMF 124 had been in the Pacific for 6 months. The pilots who followed his method were alive. The pilots who slow-turned with Zeros were in the water. The doctrine was working. But it had not been written down. It had not been codified. It had not been distributed to the squadrons that would follow. And in August 1943, Walsh would prove the principle twice in 15 days under conditions that no briefing room chart could have produced. August 1943. The Allied advance up the Solomon Islands chain had reached Munda on the island of New Georgia, 200 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The Japanese still held Bougainville, the large island at the top of the chain, and had reinforced their air facilities at Kahili, Buin, and Balal with veteran fighter units from Rabaul. These bases formed the southern perimeter of the Japanese defensive network that American planners called the Outer South Seas Defense Zone. The math was stark. The Japanese had an estimated 200 to 300 fighter aircraft based in and around Rabaul and northern Bougainville. Allied air power in the Solomons was stretched thin. Escort fighters could only reach Bougainville in limited numbers due to the fuel range of most American aircraft. The Corsair had an operational combat radius of approximately 350 miles, enough to reach Buin and have minutes of fuel to spare for a fight. The B-24 Liberator bombers the Corsairs were escorting had a range buffer, but they were slow, and the route over New Georgia Sound, the slot, was known hunting ground for Japanese interception. VMF 124's operations in August were built around the escalating Allied campaign to neutralize Kahili and Buin. The missions were long, the air battles were daily, the attrition was constant. August 15, 1943. Walsh led 5 Corsairs from Munda on combat air patrol over the Allied invasion beaches at Vella La Vella, and where American and New Zealand forces had just landed in an operation designed to leapfrog the heavily defended New Georgia. The mission briefing specified that Japanese air activity over the landing zone was expected to be modest, reconnaissance, and perhaps light harassment. The fleet below needed to be protected, but the fighter controller's assessment was that the main Japanese response would come later, once the Bougainville bases had time to organize a counterstrike. The intelligence was wrong. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the fighter director aboard a Navy destroyer below broadcast a 2-word report: large bogey. Radar had picked up an incoming formation. It was not modest. It was not reconnaissance. It had approximately 30 Japanese aircraft, a combination of Mitsubishi Zero fighters and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, were inbound to the landing beaches at Vella La Vella. Below those beaches were American and New Zealand ground troops in the first hours of an amphibious landing. Below those troops were landing craft still offloading supplies and ammunition. Below the landing craft were shallow water, and the Val dive bomber was specifically optimized to put a 550-pound bomb through the deck of a ship with an accuracy that horizontal bombers could not achieve. Walsh had 5 Corsairs against 30 Japanese aircraft. Here is the puzzle that would only become clear later. The Vals were not flying at high altitude. They were descending below 10,000 feet. Well below their normal attack profile. 0 escorts were above them. T. Walsh noted the geometry. He noted the altitude of the escorts. He noted the descent path of the bombers. He filed the observation in the back of his thinking and did not yet know what it meant. He pushed his throttle forward and dove. Walsh came in from altitude, fast. The F4U-1's engine was producing all 2,000 horsepower. He had 2,400 rounds across 6 guns. At the standard convergence of 1,000 feet, the 6.50 caliber M2 Brownings delivered a combined burst weight capable of structurally destroying any Japanese aircraft of that era in under a second of fire. The limiting factor was the pilot's aim, and the rounds remaining in the belts, a number Walsh tracked in his head throughout every engagement. The first 0 went down in the opening pass. Walsh noted it, pulled the nose back up and climbed back toward altitude. Stage 1, formidable, precise, terrifying. The 0 escorts had seen the diving attack. They were already wheeling into response. The Japanese pilots in August 1943 were not conscripts. The 204th Kokutai and the 253rd Kokutai operating out of Kahili were veterans. They had been flying combat operations in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. They had watched American tactics across a year and a half of engagements. They were disciplined. They were fast. They divided into offense and defense without verbal command. 2 elements pressed the American fighters while a third held high cover. Walsh's rounds counted down. He had 2,100 remaining as he climbed back through 15,000 feet. He came around again, not a turning engagement, another diving pass. The altitude advantage was the shield. He pressed it. At this exact moment, his radio crackled, and the fighter director was changing his assignment. The Vals had broken through the 0 screen and were now in their attack dive on the shipping below. Walsh's orders shifted. Abandon the 0 engagement and intercept the bombers. Orders changed mid-mission. Walsh drove the nose down and went for the Vals. The D-3A Val dive bomber was not a dogfighter. It was slow, underarmed for air combat, and structurally vulnerable to .50 caliber fire. But the Vals were now in their attack dive. To get ahead of them, Walsh would have to pass through the 0 escorts. Not the altitude-first approach. Through them. He went through them. His Corsair absorbed multiple 20mm cannon rounds. One hit the starboard wing fuel tank. The fuel inside the self-sealing tank compressed, sealed. The wing held. Walsh pulled into the valve formation from below and behind. He fired a burst. One valve flamed and pulled out of its dive prematurely, its bomb falling harmlessly short of the ships below. 2 more passes. A second valve went in. Another 0, pressing the attack on Walsh's aircraft, received a snap burst and broke off trailing smoke. Stage 2. Under aggressive fire, the Japanese formation began to fracture. Walsh's aircraft was hit again. His gyro compass was spinning. His Corsair was burning fuel from the damaged tank faster than the gauges reflected. He flew into a cloud to break contact. Inside the cloud, his gyros tumbled. He lost his horizon reference. He exited the cloud inverted in a 43-degree dive, pointed directly at the crater rim of an extinct volcano on the island of Kolombangara. The rim of the crater was below him. He hauled the stick back with both hands, and the blackout encroached at the edges of his vision. The gray tunnel of blood draining from his brain under the G-forces. The crater rim passed under his left wing with less clearance than a parking space. He made it back to Munda. His Corsair was declared a total loss. They stripped it for parts. He had 3 confirmed kills. The Allied troops on the Vella La Vella beaches were unharmed. He was back in the air the next morning, 15 days later. August 30th. The mission was a B-24 escort from Barakoma Airfield on Vella La Vella to Bouin on southern Bougainville, 150 miles each way over water and jungle held by Japanese forces. VMF 124 launched their Corsairs before dawn. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Walsh's engine began to run rough, power fluctuating, the cylinders misfiring in a pattern that any aircraft mechanic on Walsh, which Walsh had been, could diagnose. A fuel delivery problem likely in the carburetor. He could push the engine and risk seizing at 80 miles from land, or he could take the option that was always there and always cost time. Break off. He broke off. He landed at Munda. Here is where the curiosity puzzle planted in Section 5 begins to resolve itself. The mechanics at Munda had a single spare Corsair, not his aircraft, not his guns, not his instruments, not the aircraft he had spent weeks calibrating and trimming. A different machine with a different feel and different bore-sighted guns. Walsh had no way to know if the guns had been bore-sighted correctly. He had no way to know the fuel state history of the engine. The plane had been sitting at a forward strip in tropical heat. He took it anyway. He climbed back to altitude and flew north to rejoin the formation. He never found them. At approximately 1:20 in the afternoon, over Kahili, he found instead a formation of approximately 50 Zeros. They were Japanese Navy fighter aircraft from the 204th and 253rd Kokutai, assembled to intercept the B-24s that Walsh had been escorting. They were organized. They were at fighting altitude. They had not yet seen Walsh because he had arrived above them, a position he had held on instinct from the moment he began the inbound leg. 7 years of frontline flying had made altitude first automatic. He did not need to think about it. He simply climbed when he climbed, and the habit had positioned him above 50 enemy fighters. He was alone, and the Marines on the ground would tell this story from a different angle. Navy Seabees working a construction project near Vella La Vella were watching contrails in the sky when they saw a single aircraft hit a Japanese formation. They had no communications with the pilot. They did not know who he was. They watched what happened next the way someone watches a man walk into a fire. Walsh had counted the fighters in his scan as he set up the first pass. He had 2,400 rounds. He had roughly 30 seconds of total firing time. Against 50 aircraft. The arithmetic was simple, and the arithmetic was irrelevant. He dove. The first pass hit a 0 before the formation had identified the direction of attack. Explosion. Walsh climbed and came around. Stage 1. The Japanese formation, formidable and coordinated. I took its first hit before it recognized the threat vector. Walsh burned through the pass count. 1 confirmed, climb. 2 confirmed, climb. 3 down. His rounds were dropping. 1,800, then 1,500. He was tracking the number in his head as he pulled the nose up after each pass, trading airspeed for altitude and then converting altitude back to airspeed on the dive. The engine of the borrowed Corsair was running normally. The guns were shooting true despite the uncertainty about bore sighting. The Japanese formation adapted. Stage 2 began to give way to Stage 3. The 204th Kokutai pilots had a name among Marine aviators at this point in the campaign. They had been observed repeatedly committing to high-angle diving passes from the same initial angles, always braking hard left after their pass, never right. It was a behavioral signature that could be anticipated. On the flight line at Munda, where pilots talked and mechanics listened, this pattern had been named. They called this group the Clockwork Boys. Not because any single pilot had given them the name, but because when the 204th committed to an engagement, their geometry was as reliable as a clock's mechanism and as exploitable. The Clockwork Boys adapted now. They split into multiple elements attempting to cut off Walsh's climb path, eliminating the altitude advantage that was sustaining him. They deployed a high element to intercept him at the top of each zoom. Walsh solved this the only way possible. He stopped climbing as high. He compressed the dive and zoom cycle, spending less time at the vulnerable transition point. He was now working in a smaller altitude band, which reduced his speed on each pass and increased his exposure time in the firing envelope. On the fourth pass, two 20mm cannon shells connected. One hit the Corsair's engine cowling. The other hit the aircraft somewhere aft. Walsh felt the impact more than saw it. The engine lost power. Not catastrophically. But the climb after a pass now required full throttle to achieve 1,500 feet above the zero formation rather than the 3,000 feet he had been holding. He was losing the altitude advantage, incrementally, unavoidably. The final question was the one the Seabees below could not answer from the ground. He had 4 confirmed kills. His rounds were nearly gone. The engine was compromised. The Zeros had adapted and were closing the geometry on him. He would now face the civilian complication. Below the fight, between Walsh's position and the nearest friendly airfield, were active Coast Watcher stations, Allied intelligence operatives and their local Solomon Islander contacts, positioned across the jungle to report Japanese shipping and aircraft movements. If Walsh's aircraft came down over enemy-controlled water with a non-functional engine, a Coast Watcher network would be the only mechanism by which he might be located and retrieved. Walsh knew this. Every pilot over the Solomons knew this. And he knew that a dead-stick emergency landing in the waters near a Coast Watcher station would draw attention, Japanese attention, to that station's location. Men had died because of that geometry before. Pilots who were rescued had sometimes cost the Coast Watcher network the operatives who saved them, and he kept flying as long as the engine would carry him, as far from the Coast Watcher positions as altitude and the wind allowed. The cannon shells caught up with him. The engine was done. Not a fire, not a structural failure, just the gradual, undeniable confession of a machine that had been hit and was no longer going to pretend otherwise. The propeller slowed. The airspeed decayed. Walsh was in a power-off glide at approximately 8,000 feet, still over water, a Corsair with a dead engine and nearly empty guns descending through 7,000 feet toward the Pacific. The Zeros had not broken off. A single Zero pressed the attack from his 6 o'clock position. What the Japanese called a tail chase attack, the maneuver of choice when an enemy had lost his speed advantage and could no longer run. The attacking pilot was committed, and he was coming in fast and straight, and Walsh had a dead engine. This was the unexpected ambush, not from the original 50, but from the last single Zero that followed the crippled Corsair down, invisible in his blind spot until the tracers told him it was there. Walsh broke hard right. He had known from intelligence reports that had filtered through to every Pacific Theater aviator by mid-1943 that the Zero rolled more slowly to the right than to the left. It was a structural quirk of the aircraft's aileron design. Rolling hard right in a high-speed brake forced the pursuing Zero to match the roll. And matching that roll cost the Japanese pilot the angular tracking rate he needed to keep Walsh in his gun sight. The tracers from the Zero's 20mm cannon passed below Walsh's fuselage, close, in beneath the belly of the Corsair by a distance the Seabees later described from the ground as looking like nothing at all. The Zero did not have the altitude to re-engage. Walsh had traded the last of his airspeed for that brake, and now he was in a full power-off glide with no possibility of recovery. The borrowed Corsair was going into the water. He aimed it for the stretch of sea off Vella La Vella, not toward the Coast Watcher network. Away from it, he ditched as cleanly as a dead stick landing allows, which is not cleanly. The Pacific at 120 miles per hour does not absorb an F4U gently. He got out. The Seabees had been watching the entire fight from their construction site on the island. They had a boat. They put it in the water and went to find him. When they pulled Walsh from the sea, he was alive, and the borrowed Corsair was at the bottom of the Solomon Sea. He had destroyed 4 Zeros, alone, 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, against 50. Post-war interrogation records from Japanese naval aviators who had fought over Bougainville in August 1943 would confirm what the Seabees had seen from below. The 204th Kokutai's operations report for August 30th noted an unplanned American fighter attack on the fighter cover formation over Kahili. A single aircraft, diving from above, executing repeated high-altitude passes that the formation had been unable to neutralize quickly due to the attacker's refusal to engage in horizontal maneuvering combat. The Japanese assessment, the American pilot had consistently maintained the altitude advantage throughout the engagement, in which had prevented the Zero formation's standard response geometry from being effective. The operational analysis used a phrase translated from the Japanese that Marine intelligence officers noted in their debrief summaries. The attacker had fought from above and had forced the response. The Seabees foreman wrote a short account of what he had seen. He described a single Corsair against a swarm of Japanese fighters and the sequence of diving passes that had whittled the swarm down 4 aircraft at a time. He did not know the pilot's name yet. He wrote only that the pilot had, in his judgment, died during the engagement, and that he had been wrong about that. On February 8, 1944, at the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on First Lieutenant Kenneth A. Walsh, and the citation covered both August 15 and August 30, 1943. It was the first Medal of Honor awarded to a Corsair pilot in the war. But the decoration was secondary to what Walsh had done with the 7 months preceding it. VMF 124 had entered combat with no written Corsair doctrine. The plane was new, the pilots were outnumbered, and the received wisdom from Wildcat veterans told them only to go after the enemy. Walsh had replaced that instruction with a precise tactical framework. Maintain altitude above 20,000 feet whenever the mission profile allows. Do not enter a turning engagement below 300 miles per hour. Attack in diving passes and climb away. Never fight the Zeros fight. By the time Walsh left the Pacific in September 1943, other Corsair squadrons had arrived: VMF 214, VMF 215, VMF 221. And they asked the pilots of VMF 124 how to employ the aircraft. The answers they received had Walsh's fingerprints on every line. Altitude is paramount. Speed is armor, high and fast or not at all. The Corsair's overall kill ratio across the Pacific War would eventually reach 11-1. Against the Zero specifically, Corsair pilots claimed a 12-1 advantage. These numbers encompass the entire war. Better aircraft, more experienced pilots, larger formations, improved intelligence. But the tactical foundation those numbers were built on had been tested and written in the skies over the Solomons in 1943 by a mechanic from Brooklyn who had understood, from first principles, what the plane could do if you flew it from the right altitude. The photograph Walsh carried in his chest pocket on every mission. His wife, his son, came home with him. He had carried it on all 140 combat missions across 3 combat tours. It traveled from Henderson Field to Munda to Barracoma, to the waters off Vella La Vella and back to Washington, D.C., and then to Jacksonville, Florida, where Walsh became a training instructor and passed the doctrine to the next generation of Corsair pilots. Every man he taught would carry some version of the altitude first principle into the air. They would not always know where it came from. The Japanese response to the tactical shift was documented in Luftwaffe liaison reports shared between Japanese and German air commands, as well as in American intelligence assessments from captured Japanese aircrew. By late 1943, the Japanese fighter doctrine had begun to emphasize prepositioning above likely American approach corridors, an acknowledgement that American pilots were no longer reliably approaching at bomber altitude. The Zero pilots began climbing higher before American formations arrived. The effort to recapture altitude dominance was a structural admission. They had lost it. The Clockwork Boys of the 204th Kokutai changed their post-attack brake geometry by November 1943. The predictable left-hand brake was gone. They had adapted, but the adaptation was itself a response, a concession in tactics, to what Walsh and the pilots who followed him had made impossible. The photograph was still in Walsh's pocket when he returned to the Pacific in April 1945, flying a newer F4U from Okinawa with VMF 222. He was 38 years old, and he shot down his 21st and final enemy aircraft, a kamikaze, on June 22, 1945. He was still climbing to altitude before he committed. Walsh retired from the Marine Corps on February 1, 1962, after 28 years of service. Lieutenant Colonel. He had flown combat missions in 3 separate Pacific campaigns, transported wounded in Korea, and spent a year in Japan as an aircraft maintenance officer. A role that would have seemed predictable perhaps to anyone who had known the young mechanic at Quantico in 1934 and nothing about what came after. He received the Medal of Honor, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Air Medals, and 7 Strike/Flight Air Medals. He rarely discussed the total. After retirement, Walsh remained active in veteran organizations and gatherings of Medal of Honor recipients. He was selected by the Air Command and Staff College's Gathering of the Eagles program in 1987, and honored again in 1993. He was one of the men they brought in to teach the next generation of officers why things had gone the way they went. Kenneth Ambrose Walsh died on July 30, 1998. He was 81 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In the museum archives that hold his combat records, the mission logs show 140 sorties and 21 confirmed kills. They also show the aircraft he flew on August 30, 1943, listed as Bureau Number Unknown, because it was not his aircraft. It was a borrowed machine from a forward strip at Munda, flown by a pilot who had no choice but to climb alone into 50 enemy fighters and apply one more time the principle he had proved all summer. Altitude is the only variable that matters. That is not a sentiment. It is the conclusion of a man who flew the geometry 140 times and checked the answer against the evidence every time he landed. The men who came after him, the ones who never met Walsh, who never heard his name, who simply flew the doctrine as it was written and came home. They were part of the answer too. They just did not know who had written the question. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. And make sure the notification bell is on so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Did you have family who served in the Pacific? Tell us about them. These stories belong to everyone who keeps them alive. You are part of why we remember. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you.